We got this guy Trump in charge now. All bets are off now. You know, I went out there to see what was going on because the enemy right now is the government. It's always been the government, but hopefully people start waking up. You know, we need to take care of business now. It's no more joking around.
You don't see in the media, things have happened at the bridge then as well, where DAPL security guards had live ammunition pointed at us, basically trying to find a reason to storm the camp. You have to remember that the veterans that were there, 2,000 or 2,100 of them were sponsored for, 4,000 had shown up. And then, boom, there was a blizzard the day they showed up. Blizzard with freezing temperatures. I had 3 pairs of long johns on, good boots. I had sub-zero sleeping bag, everything, and my fingers I still couldn't feel. They were out there in terrible conditions, not expecting that to have happened. And to have turned around with that many people, I have to commend them, and I have to commend the tribes that were there as well. They were all looking out, everybody was looking out for the welfare of everyone involved. What I'd like you guys to get out, because you have all the equipment to do so, they need people. They just need people who can take care of them. So it's freezing up there. So a lot of the people that are going from the camp and the natives themselves, they can't get up there to buy long johns. They can't get up there to go into town to get their mail because they're being harassed. So, you know, if anybody can get up there or send donations and you can send it to individual people, please do.
The only thing that are moving these things forward are grassroots direct actions and grassroots direct action movements, right? And so literally the pipeline was supposed to be pumping right about now. And if everything had gone on without the resistance, that oil would be flowing right now. And so I think that the direct action that we saw on the pipeline route, directly getting in the way of the pipeline's infrastructure and their logistic flows, was a key part of what has created this kind of temporary victory right now. And, you know, when my friends, you know, kind of like, you know, ask, you know, was this a victory, that sort of thing, I think it's more of a pause than a victory right now. And I think it's really important to give a little context to that, particularly where this was happening. So this camp happens at the confluence of the Cannonball Rivers and the Missouri Rivers. The reason that they call it the Camp of the Sacred Stones is because many years ago, the whirling vortex would create these huge orb stones that were a part of ceremony and a big part of people's identity there. As you can kind of see from some of these pictures, kind of the bleakness of what it's like when the police state completely takes off its gloves. And that's what we saw in North Dakota. And there's a long history of white supremacy, of resource exploitation and colonization there. You know, this is the racism of what Winona LaDuke calls the deep north, right? And if you haven't been to Dakota and experienced it, it's really a shocking thing. I mean, it's a very active sort of colonization. And, you know, one image that I think will stay with me forever is during the raid on the 1851 treaty camp that was on the pipeline route. You had these cops coming forward, literally swinging and beating elders, tasing people in the face. I work as a medic up there, and we just dealt with grievous injuries for months up there. But literally right behind the cop line, the DAPL bulldozers were bulldozing grave sites, and you could see it right behind it. And so kind of the ideology of the cops is protecting and serving public safety, as, you know, Sheriff DAPL or Kirchmeier talks about. You can kind of see kind of the naked power of what colonial reality is in this country, and kind of the continuity of that, which is, I think, in the stories that are being told about this, one of the key stories is that honoring that indigenous resistance that has been happening for generations upon generations. And you see this to extent in the film, but you know, some of the more incredible things, like them taking out Custer's gun to remind them that, like, they have defeated the army before and they're willing to fight and do incredible things to defend that water. It was very humbling, to say the least, to be there, to understand this lineage of history and struggle that I think a lot of us can learn a lot from. And part of that is being able to directly confront state power. You know, it was there. You know, prayer and peaceful protests were a big part of the narrative that was created on this, but every day there is direct action happening. There were people are getting in the way of the cops, getting in the way of the pipeline workers. And that it was very difficult to see, and you saw it in bits and pieces. And I think a lot of props go out to the independent filmmakers like Kanahus, who was featured there, West Coast Women's Warrior Cooperative, Unicorn Riot, like a number of community-based media institutions that were getting that story out, because that sort of direct action, I think, speaks to the reality of what's coming in the next couple years, which is I think one of the key lessons on this is, how do we fight as a grassroots army when political institutions have failed? How do we intervene in the flows of capital? How do we intervene in the actual logistical building of these projects all around? Because that's what we're going to see in the coming years, is kind of the multiplication of Standing Rock here, the ripple effects of this, where hundreds and thousands of people were touched by this and have now the experience of standing together and facing off with the cops, facing off with these companies, of running these media campaigns that were having to kind of combat the smear campaign and kind of the terrorist brush that they wanted to sweep over people. And that's really important. And I think it's also really important, the solidarity that's happening from coastal cities, both materially in terms of media, that continues, not just for Standing Rock and whatever comes in the next wave of that struggle, but also to the emergent struggles that are happening all around, like pipeline struggles in Arkansas, struggles in Diné-Bakay, my own homeland, where people are fighting new uranium mines, new tar sands mines, new fracking operations, and that we get really good at creating these networks of support and care and material support that exist all across the continent to be able to directly intervene into the flows of capital. And in doing so, perhaps take an important lesson about our own role and place on this land and what it means to live here ethically and what it means to live in common with each other in the sort of world that we might want to see, you can see kind of take place in these camps. And for the 4 months that I was there, it was a very different existence where, if a car got stuck, I'd go to ThunderClan across the street because their big ass truck could haul anything out. When like the elders across the other street needed some water, or wood or whatever it was, there was a much different sort of rhythm of life. The value of what life was worth there was much different. And I think these experiences in blockading capital, blockading their world and unleashing our own, as one saying goes, I think does have a great deal of descriptive power of this. But I think in kind of this moment of pause that we're having right now, it's really worth to have really deep reflections on what we learned here and, most importantly, what comes next.
Despite the weather, despite the kind of time, despite everything, the siege, the legal threats, the kind of, even this water cannon kind of act, which was totally heinous, people just keep flooding in. And I think basically this veterans thing that I'm curious to hear more about was really a kind of climax in some way in terms of the narrative, which was really this looming threat of like, what the fuck's going to happen when these thousands of veterans come in? Both tactically within the camp, there's a lot of curiosity about this possibility of storming this bridge blockade with the veterans. Are the police and National Guard and everyone's security going to attack the veterans the same way they had attacked Native people? And what would that look like in a media kind of world? But also just, these tactical things. So I think all of this, basically, it seemed to us, led to the fact that they just kind of called it off or backed off, and led to this kind of political victory, if you will, of the Army Corps not wanting to see what would happen if you kind of went there. Another kind of point to think about is just within the veteran thing, and just to think more about that there was already this militarized sense of what was happening at Standing Rock, both from the presence of the National Guard, this kind of this checkpoint that was set up, both the equipment of the police and security forces that was incredibly militarized, this blockade that has all this kind of barbed wire and trucks and tanks and all of these things, the water cannon, obviously, and even just to think of this veteran identity, many of the Native peoples who have been occupying Standing Rock that were themselves already veterans. Native people serve in the military and the armed forces at a higher rate given their proportion within the population, and many, even alongside this kind of warrior identity, part of that is also related to their service in the kind of armed forces, which they obviously have mixed feelings about or something. But there was already kind of thousands of veterans there even before this kind of veteran mobilization. And I think it was an interesting dynamic. Like, even people that we were camping with kind of were kind of excited or happy about the veteran thing. And we didn't know that they were veterans, but they pulled out their kind of veteran hats and stuff like this. And that was just kind of interesting. Another thing to talk about maybe is, to some extent, the kind of anticlimax, actually, of the announcement of the Army Corps' kind of statement, even though what had been seen like on Facebook or in the national media as this kind of heroic, celebratory moment. Within the camp, from what we understand, what we kind of saw was a kind of subdued skepticism that there actually wasn't this celebratory moment of like, oh, we won. But like people kind of explained to us, and we kind of, heard that actually people were kind of not kind of cheering and roaring all night or whatever. People were kind of a little muted or something. And I think that's interesting. And also to think about how the media itself can construct these moments of affect or like celebration or victory, or like even to kind of create its own narrative of the movement where it's like, okay, you won, like go home, like it's over. Even if in the camp no one thinks that or feels like that, but the media itself or even Facebook can create this kind of image. I think another interesting thing related to the media and just related to the kind of duration and persistence and resilience of the movement is the extent to which that DAPL kind of basically lost public opinion. And, most of the media kind of coverage was based on these confrontations, which increasingly the state looked excessive. And, in the case of the dogs, very early on in September, the dog attacks of the people by private security, and leading obviously to the climax of the water cannons, and freezing temperature, was just totally indefensible. And I think more and more they were kind of losing this battle, and even the governor of North Dakota himself talked about how the media just made it so difficult. But like Will was saying, locally it's interesting because we've also heard or read polls within Bismarck or North Dakota. If you ask people there, they'll be like, oh, the Indians are violent, or they're kind of a nuisance, or it's their fault, or they're causing this conflict. So there is this dynamic of like the local kind of population of North Dakota or non-native population versus just the national kind of public sentiment. So I think that's a kind of interesting dynamic. There's lots of stories on the media of like, oh, don't go. If you can't go for 6 months, don't bother. But like people were there, they were like, oh, I'm just grateful that people came and just wanted to talk or wanted to listen. Obviously people shouldn't go and like go with nothing and no preparation or no experience or skills or resources. But at the same time, there was a kind of welcoming spirit within the movement of people wanting, and like the kind of curiosity was very much embraced. One interesting dynamic we noticed on the recent trip is something like a kind of downtown was created within the main camp, like right when you would come in by the main kind of sacred fire or the main meal halls or whatever, or the main supply things. This is more where you saw a lot of non-native people or white people who kind of came themselves or individually, maybe without kind of broader networks or without contacts or something. And somehow, kind of like in the city or something, like in New York, people would kind of gather in this downtown, and some of the mess halls were almost like entirely non-native, whereas you had on the outskirts these kind of people living with their families, living in community in the kind of suburbs or something like that. And somehow you had very little interaction between people living in community or native families and this kind of downtown. And in some ways it was kind of interesting that this was happening, but in some ways kind of problematic in the way that the city could be kind of problematic, like this kind of lack of exchange or kind of dialogue, or like people in some of the kind of further out encampments that people were living with their families or whatever, would never go to these mess halls where these kind of like maybe hippies or something were just gathering just with other hippies or whatever. So that was just to put that out there.
We arrived there the day after Thanksgiving. So we encountered that first impression of actually seeing the amount of people, of how the camp has increased, despite the weather. But it was also like a few days after the eviction was announced. So there was also a lot of preparation of this might be real. Like, we need to get cars, we need to prepare, we need to have a plan. A lot of the people who we met, that I met through Matt last trip, had actually gone back to their houses and brought their kids. So there was a lot of more like a family environment in the camp that we noticed. And for that reason also, like the preparations for like a possible eviction, or just like actually needing wood, needing food, needing water bottle, and propane tanks, was actually like, we actually do need this now. So some of the friends that we were spending time like that weekend, they needed a car. They had to get a car. So it was just interesting to see like how immediate the needs are because of how real they are, and like how the fear and the danger you can feel it. And also there, on that moment, there was also like this funny comment on the response to the governor when the Army Corps of Engineers took back the eviction, but then it was took over by the governor that said like, oh, it's because we're concerned for the people because of the weather conditions. And as Matt was saying, like most of these groups, through Sundance and through ceremony and through all these very deep experiences they share, they know how to live through the winter and through the different elements and through the different seasons. So their reply was that considering that the governor and the whole structure are newcomers, it's normal that they would be concerned about the weather, but they know how to live in the weather. So that was also kind of interesting to see those responses and like just that reality of like the settlers and those concerns and the excuses of being concerned with the people when just a few weeks before they were attacked with water tanks in below freezing temperatures. I think that also something that I want to share because it's very close to my heart is like how this has echoed some other struggles that are going through. I'm from Ecuador, and today one of the mining camps that was taken over by the shore community a few weeks ago has seen a huge militarization today. And it's just like coming back what you were saying, Will, that this is not something new of how like energy plants and mining camps and oil drilling are actually going for indigenous ancestral lands, and that's not a coincidence. And it's being seen like, as you said, all around Turtle Island, but also throughout South America. And I think about the media, also what we were sharing, like we left the day that we received the news, but we left before. And just like the idea that we experienced of seeing like this victory when it was actually not how it was being experienced there, but it made us experience even there, like after some hours, how the whole manipulation happens and how it's so easy to get to buy it.
We had a delegation of folks that headed out to Standing Rock in probably around, I think folks started getting out there November 18th, something like that. And I drove with another member who couldn't unfortunately be here from New York, Eli Wright, who was a combat medic in the Army and served in Iraq. And so we drove from New York with a bunch of gear. We picked up a military tent along the way in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then landed in Standing Rock around the 23rd, I think it was, the 22nd and the 23rd. When we got into Oceti Sakowin, the main camp, I think we both kind of experienced this moment of kind of almost this like almost physical sensation of being in a place that felt really familiar, in the sense that the militarization around the camp, the concertina wire, the barricades, the helicopters that were buzzing overhead really, frequently, the floodlights that DAPL had installed on the hills that you can see in some of those pictures. For both of us, we kind of like looked at each other and had this sense of going back to Iraq, going back to a forward operating base out there. And the very first thing that we linked up with our folks that had already kind of set up camp, and went to the vets tent to link up with folks there. And the very first thing they said was, okay, you guys are vets. Hey, a bunch of, militarized looking white dudes came in a bunch of unmarked cars. Go find them and keep them there if you find them. It's like, holy shit. Well, so, I think that it very quickly, I think as a lot of folks have said, there's like a sense of a very different rhythm of life. What I say this piece about the militarized, the kind of militarized, especially northern part of the camp next to the bridge, but that was not the case inside of the camp, right? And I think that's like, as has been demonstrated already. I think there was a lot of things that were really beautiful. What I kind of have told folks is that my experience was that I had no touch point for any of it, over and over and over again, and I'm, that's not the case for me all that frequently, and so I think that our folks very quickly, we connected with some of our allies with the Indigenous Peoples Power Project, and the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, who had a delegation. But as we were kind of coming up there, we started to hear about this veterans mobilization. And to be honest, that wasn't on our radar. And as we read the op order, and op order is kind of a military who, what, where, when, why, we're like, a number of us were feeling pretty uncomfortable about it, to be 100% honest. Because for some of us, I feel like there was a sense of like, this does feel a little bit militarized. It does feel like there are a lot of X factors here that could not work out. And if I was DAPL, I would throw 50 vets into the midst of there as infiltrators and screw a lot of shit up for people. And so I think the more that we thought about it and the more we realized the timing about it, the kind of sense of serendipity, hey, we already have a number of folks here, we started to think, actually, we should stay. Because there are warrior societies out here that are holding it down from the different nations, but we might be one of the few groups of organized vets out here. So we put the call out pretty quickly to our members, let's join this. And we had, and interestingly, I kind of feel like Standing Rock, for a lot of folks, not just our community, is kind of like this nerve bundle that got touched, and it kind of electrified a network, because we had folks that had been really involved in IVAW in the past and kind of had taken a break from it who showed up. We had new folks that had never been involved in IVAW who showed up, which was, I think, really incredible. And obviously, I don't know the last time that many veterans have shown up to anything political since maybe as far back as the Bonus Army back in the 20s. That's probably not true, at least, since the 70s with VVAW. And so I think that we basically started to build relationships with folks on the ground, relationships that we either already had or that folks kind of introduced us, and connect to the headsmen, the Oceti Sakowin headsmen, and some representatives from the tribe. And it was very clear that at that point that the desire was, we don't want to necessarily send a bunch of people in kind of haphazardly to take a hill. We actually want to kind of dial some of that back. And I think that, I think it was Dave who was talking about trauma. Faith Spotted Eagle, who's an elder, who I think had, really held some amazing space and kind of touched upon the fact that there was this kind of linked trauma, or at least an understanding of trauma, both for indigenous communities, but also for the veterans that were there, right? And, I think that who knows, it's hard to know what would have happened if the blizzard hadn't taken place. But I think that, and I think that for some veterans, which I can understand, there was a sense of frustration because people did want to be in service by using their bodies, right? And that can play out in a whole lot of different ways. And I think that part of how we understood our role to be is to support in the ways that leadership there, Native leadership, really envisioned us to be there. Whether that was de-escalatory or whatever that looked like. And, I think that myself and a few other folks stayed for about 2.5 weeks. And, as has been touched on, when the easement was declared denied, I think there was a kind of uneasy sense, and we decided to leave a stay behind crew. And after the blizzard, we helped evacuate people that weren't prepared. And our stay behind folks who were kind of helping, supporting, cleaning up, and doing various things, realized pretty quickly that that the wishes of the elders in the camp was that if you're not 100% ready to stay here in these conditions, like, maybe it's not a good idea to be here. in the sense of how that can play out for, just the kind of collectivity. And we still have a few folks there that have been there for months and really have been supporting more as individuals. But I think that I think for a lot of our people, it was a really profound experience. I think people who came in as deep atheists had experiences they wouldn't have expected. I think that that it has got the gears going for me a lot about what our role is in future things like this. But what about Standing Rock is an example that we need to take into different communities, and be building our future work around the sense of political vision, the sense of solidarity, things like that.
Hi, I'm Julie. I'm currently living in New York, but originally from Florida, and I am involved with Paper Tiger Television. So I went out there with Aneeta and some other people kind of right around this on Thanksgiving Day. So I kind of experienced a lot of the Thanksgiving surge, I guess. And then I was there for, I guess, until the next Friday. So you could definitely see right around Sunday, so many people just started leaving. And I definitely agree with what one of you all were saying about how it's so great to get new people in there and get people to support. But I think I definitely experienced a lot of the conflicts and tension that was also bringing. A lot of people going in for just a few days, maybe they're unprepared. I wasn't really fully prepared for how cold it was going to be. And so that just really is also a drain of resources. And so I think it is good for people to go and definitely go, but be prepared. And maybe to just, if anyone is thinking about going maybe after the winter, to just consider how much are you spending, or don't fundraise for yourself. Maybe you can donate money to the camps and to support people there. So that's something that I experienced. I guess people have said a lot, so I won't say so many things. But one thing that was really powerful was just the community that has been created there by folks who have been there for months since the spring. It's such a warm and welcoming and supportive place. You can just go and talk to anyone, and there's such a level of respect that people have for each other, whether you're there for a short amount of time or whether you've been there. Respect is very important. I think since we were there at this interesting time where it was after the extreme repression, but before kind of the easement was denied, there was a lot of definitely preparing for evictions in the camp, so there weren't so many actions. But I think that also, since there weren't so many actions going on, it kind of allowed a lot of time for discussion and connecting with people. There was a lot of really great work being done around thinking about colonization and what does that mean for people who live in this land and who are a part of settler colonialism. So every night they would have a discussion in this main dome area where sometimes hundreds of people would go, and they would go around and just kind of everyone would ask questions and talk about what is our role in settler colonialism? How are we complicit? What privileges do we have? All sorts of things. What does it mean to decolonize? What does that look like? So I think there's really important work that's going on because this community has come together. And another thing that I would say is important is there's definitely a focus on centering Indigenous voices all the time, because those are the people who have started this, who have been there. And so as someone who's coming just for 1 week, it was very nice to see that's being thought about all the time. And sometimes people don't say the right thing or center whiteness a lot, and there's definitely people calling that out and having discussions saying no, it's not about that. Let's see. I guess one other thing is thinking about how we can help as people who are not there or who live in New York or other places. Definitely donating is important, raising money, having fundraisers, having conversations like this, participating or organizing actions around like divesting and the banks. Those are things we can all do here, to get involved in Indigenous struggles where we live and to find out like whose land are we on right now? Are there struggles we can participate in? Are there other pipeline struggles that we can, go and be a part of? So yeah, maybe we can talk about like ways forward and things we can do in solidarity in the larger discussion.
I think what was something that was really a place of like pause and thoughtfulness, even before entering the camp, is who we are as as people, as guests of Indigenous folks, of Oceti Sakowin people, of a group of folks that have been struggling since April for a pipeline to be stopped. So what does it mean to go in with a decolonial perspective? What does it mean to replenish as much as you're taking, as much as you can prepare for a North Dakota winter? You're outside the entire time doing work and doing and being a part of meetings. And so I think it was definitely difficult as someone from California and not with like that history. And so constantly I was thinking over and over again, how can I be of service? How can I be of service? I'm on Indigenous land. How can I be of service? And I think that that needs to happen kind of all the time versus just like when I'm very clearly and blatantly a part of an Indigenous struggle. I think wherever we are, Indigenous struggle exists because of the colonial relationship that this country has to Indigenous communities, and the erasure of Indigenous communities. So like we might not be in constant communication in community with Indigenous folks where we live right now, but that they're here and their struggles continue over here as well. And like how a lot of people have said, how can we engage where we are and go when we are called to go to struggles far from where we are. There was something in the like rest period of the police and military repression that happened on Sunday. And before like the vets came and like before the easement happened was like these decolonizing processes, these conversations. And I think that was coming from, things taking and lots of people coming in and like trash being spewed. Maybe not as much as maybe like a concert, but like definitely like the vibe was different, right? And like, we had just come, and so this is just like based off of what people had talked to us about and the conversations that we got to be a part of, was that like, some people came in and took whatever they needed to take to get that experience, to get that learning. And a lot of these decolonial discussions were about like, if you're coming here to just learn, like, that's where your privilege is. Like your privilege is that like you get to be so removed that this is like a learning experience for you. And it's not around like, it's not deeply around like service and like how to make this camp stronger, how to be really in deep solidarity with the needs of Indigenous communities that have been there. So yeah, that was a very the constant reminders of decolonization and how like far we are from it, to be really real, like that people can come into like a decolonizing struggle essentially, right? That indigenous sovereignty is being demanded, and people can come into this struggle as non-indigenous people and not have any framework about colonization, not have any historical frameworks whatsoever, and can use the language of universality as a way to disregard the really different experiences that folks of color, indigenous folks, folks that live in the margins constantly experience. So that was a lot of labor, and how much labor that indigenous folks have to carry, just like they have to carry the labor of like having direct but compassionate confrontations with like non-native folks coming in, just wanting to like take and not replenish, wanting to like ask questions about like what is privilege, or oh well, you know, we're all the same. Well, you should have done your homework before you came to an indigenous struggle, and so like they have to like do that labor, and then the labor of like the elders, like the native elders, having different tactics than like maybe indigenous youth, and like that sort of kind of labor that's always happening. And then obviously like the state struggle, the confrontation between the state and that constant fear and labor that indigenous folks over there have to deal with. And that's just so many layers, and how much can folks hold. And I think keeping that in mind always is will humble you, and also will compel us to keep doing as much as we can to stop pipelines, but also to be in alignment with indigenous communities.
I flew into Minneapolis and I met another member. We couldn't fly directly into Bismarck because of the roadblocks. So we drove from Minneapolis there, and we had to take a detour to come from the south, and just stopping along the way to get supplies and everything that we needed. We had a lot of different people ask us, oh, are you going to Standing Rock? Because it was an Asian person with a Caucasian lady, and she was a lot older, so it looked really suspicious. And we also came with a Marine, and so he looked suspicious. So it was just like really awkward. Fortunately, we were like, oh, we're just going hiking. Totally obvious, you know? Like, we're definitely lying. I'm just like, oh my God, this feels weird. There's like no other minorities in South Dakota right now. But finally we get to Standing Rock on the 2nd, and I had a lot of anxiety. I was worried about, you know, the veterans coming from Standing Rock. Veterans stand for Standing Rock. I was a little anxious, like I didn't know what to expect. Definitely didn't want anybody to get hurt. You put a bunch of veterans together, they get a little crazy, you know, even if they have good intentions. I just remember after my 2nd day, that's whenever a lot of the veterans start showing up, and just driving around the camp, we had to go get firewood. It made me really, I like started crying just because I was very overwhelmed. It went from a lot of people to a lot of fucking people. Like it was just, you know, a cluster. But fortunately, we had a veterans meeting, and the elders were like, we're not gonna do any actions. We're gonna move forward with peace and peace and prayer. And so just looking around the room, a lot of the veterans, there were some that was kind of like, they were disappointed, but I didn't care about that. I was just happy that, you know, we were gonna be peaceful. And so after that, like a few days later, the blizzard hit, kind of not happy about cold, but then also like glad because that pushed a lot of veterans to leave. It's just, my whole experience with Standing Rock was amazing. I cannot express it enough. Like if you go there, you always want to go back. Like it's like something draws you back. It's, I don't know, it's sacred, you know, you just feel it in your blood, like just being there. just if you go to Standing Rock, make sure you're really, really prepared. And not only that, please share your experiences with anybody that will listen to you. It needs to get out. The fight is so not over. I just remember when the Army Corps of Engineers, put out the announcement, I had a lot of people put on my Facebook, oh, you guys won. I'm like, we didn't win anything, This is just a small battle that we overcame, But just like encouraging people to get out of their bubble. I'm not gonna lie, I was in a bubble, I was just happy, didn't know what it was really, just trying to like stay ignorant and pretend like the world is perfect, but it's not. Like just Standing Rock, and just now even with Corpus Christi, with the water that's happening close to home, that's where I'm from, is Texas. It's just everybody needs to stand up and fight, and just being at Standing Rock, like everybody coming together was amazing. I would be in my tent, and at 11 o'clock at night, you could just hear people, hey, do you need any help? Hey, do you need any help? Like it really brings you like a sense of community and just gives you like a sense of purpose again, to give you like that hope in people again, especially with the election and being from a red state. Like I was really pissed off, just it's so incredible. I mean, always definitely to leave more than you take. Don't come to Standing Rock because you think that it's going to be fun so that you can have Instagram photos. You know what I mean? Go there to help, take your skills, use your voice, Sorry, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I'm a little nervous. But that's it. That's all I can really give to you guys.
How direct, of a connection or not do you think it was, your presence being there and that announcement?
Obviously, it's anyone's guess. I mean, I think that what we have tried to center is that this, this victory of a small battle is very much, because of the indigenous resistance that that Standing Rock is and continues to be. I think from a standpoint of in the escalation that we've seen, that our experience in IVAW in the past has been that police are not real keen on beating up veterans. It doesn't look very good. There becomes sometimes a question of it puts them in a crisis moment where they're really questioning what they're doing, because a lot of cops are formerly veterans or have connections to the military. I wasn't there personally. I had just got out of the military, but in 2008, a number of our folks, about 60 of our folks, marched down to the DNC and kind of faced off with the cops, and were kind of talking to them in ways that they could relate to, as being like, saying essentially over megaphones, we know what it's like to be on that side of the line. We know what it's like to question what you're doing. We know what it's like to feel that pain in your back when you're wearing, this heavy gear, and you don't have to do this, basically. And that did result in people kind of coming off of the line. So I think that sometimes those confrontations, the state doesn't want that to happen. But I think it's a small piece and, obviously a much larger struggle and fight. But yeah, I don't know for certain.
There's a couple layers of kind of the police repression that were happening there. At the basis level, Morton County was the coordinating sheriff of that. And at a higher level, G4S was a private security organization that was paid for by DAPL to run security. And then other information indicates that an outfit called Tiger Swan was the private intelligence coordinator outfit that did that. And then in a much bigger sense, these emergency management compacts between different states then allowed different jurisdictions to send troopers in to reinforce those ranks. All of those police departments benefit from that program and their experience with military-grade tactics. Vehicles like the MRAP and the Bearcat that we saw out there just reflects this larger reality of militarization that's kind of like the new normal of what we're in right now. But I think there's a couple key cracks in that are really important to reflect on, because it shows where popular power can resist police militarization. So one of those were jurisdictions where the cops were coming from, people would mobilize to demand those cops be sent back. For example, Minneapolis occupied their city hall to demand that Hennepin County pull their sheriffs back, which they then did. Similarly, in Montana, political pressure from the tribes there made sure that cops weren't coming out from there. So I think that that's actually a really important lesson from this, is that there are cracks in the police state and that we can organize to open those cracks up to make sure that that violence isn't inflicted. I think on another level, this really means that we need to study and understand much better the private intelligence world out there, because that is a reality that's starting to become more and more normal. So companies like G4S, Tiger Swan, Stratfor, the private intelligence company that advises a lot of these oil companies, this is kind of this shadow security apparatus that has been built up in the past decade and more, that is really going to affect the ability of social movements to operate in this country. And we really need to understand the inner workings of those and begin to mobilize to both deconstruct and abolish those institutions.
I think it's interesting and speaks to some extent the kind of cowardice of Obama and his administration in not really taking on this issue, because technically the reservation is a federal territory or property or something, so it's not part of Morton County. But then Morton County and then to some extent the state of North Dakota were it was kind of just put in their hands to deal with this crisis or conflict or something without the kind of real participation of the federal government or something. I don't know what that would have looked like or something, but in some ways, obviously Morton County had never dealt with anything like this. It had no conception of what it would mean. And also kind of North Dakota on a state level or something, like technically reservations are not part of the state of North Dakota or the county. They're their own sovereign territory or something like that. And you saw that a little bit with so the state or county, couldn't enter onto the reservation, or the kind of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency or something, has their own kind of jurisdictional. So there was this kind of jurisdictional clusterfuck, but to some extent kind of points to the kind of lack of vision or leadership from, the Obama administration and his kind of just total avoidance of having to deal with it. The one kind of horrible statement he made where he was kind of pressed on it was like, we're going to let this play out for several more weeks or something, which was just, a real embarrassment. It was similar to his kind of embarrassing kind of performance in Flint when he went to Flint and drank water. It was maybe one of the most shameful things I've seen, from a president, in my lifetime. Him kind of cowardly drinking this cup of water in Flint. I think similarly, the administration's kind of failure within Standing Rock, is partly, you can see it in these jurisdictional issues and the lack of really anyone wanting to take on these kind of natives or these veterans or something. No one really knew what to do about it. And I think, part of it is these jurisdictional issues to think about, which gets to what you're talking about, these kind of broader settler colonial issues. Who were these territories? What are these traditional territories that exist? What are the reservations that kind of exist that may or may not correspond to traditional, ancestral territories? What are the different kind of administrative lines of county and state and federal kind of jurisdiction? Even within this kind of crazy Bundy thing, this whatever, these kind of jurisdictional issues, who's brought in, what are the kind of legal ways of dealing with these things is kind of quite interesting and might, increasingly come up in this kind of shift towards right-wing kind of authoritarian imaginary of the U.S. and this kind of alt-right European-American kind of conception of the current state of politics or something. I think as, Trump's, vision of, climate change denial and increase wanting to construct, within his 100-day plan, he wants part of that is to re-permit the Keystone Pipeline. And, others, obviously, when his administration is in, who knows how they'll relate to these kind of hearings or whatever. So I think, these questions will continue to come up about jurisdiction and sovereignty and contestation of land and infrastructure projects, et cetera.
I think that also is related with thinking of colonialism as something that happened, or like a certain event that happened at a certain point of time, when it's really more about power structures that are still happening, and we can see it in what is happening in Standing Rock, that is really not at all far from what happened centuries ago. And also from thinking about privilege and identity, I'm mixed race. So I have indigenous, and also, so I have this conflict of being the settler and also being the one who was oppressed. And I think that although that it's more of how you see, for me, it's also a process of taking out the settler identity, because it's not my identity. Being a settler is more of a power structure and how you function on that structure. but knowing the history of how race and color scheme plays on that, and how I have been privileged to like in certain things for my color scheme, that's real. But just like this detaching oneself from thinking of settler as one identity, but seeing that that's also just how you function on that structure and how you can create consciousness and think about, and I don't know, just be more conscious on how you function.
It's been spoken about as the largest tribal gathering of nations in history since colonization, that the Standing Rock occupation was the single largest gathering of different tribal nations from this hemisphere to come together for a common purpose. And that's obviously an amazing historical feat and accomplishment, but also brought its own complications within the relationship of those tribes. It's also spoken about as the largest gathering of native and non-native peoples ever, also since colonization, similarly to come together for a common purpose or to share and occupy space together. Obviously, that would bring with it kind of complications and things to work out over the last 500 years or something, but I think necessarily, as we've spoken about, this increase in kind of infrastructural and kind of environmental issues are going to bring these kind of peoples and spaces and communities together in kind of both common cause and also conflict. I think, like a lot of people spoke about, the incredible amount of kind of settler racism within North Dakota was quite, powerful. Even Bismarck is just about 45 minutes away. And people there from the tribe and reservation said this probably set, racial relations within the area back, 20, 30 years or something. This thing, even if, the casino was relatively recent and the casino had become a kind of valve within which kind of non-native people could relate to the tribe and reservation. And there's concerts and things like that there that people would come to. But now, at some of the actions that had taken place in Mandan and Bismarck and just the general, suspicion and conflict over Morton County and the governor's relationship, it's going to be incredibly fraught, in the next 5, 10, 20 years, how the tribe and reservation relates to the broader kind of area around it. And I think in particular, as we've spoken about with this new Trump administration and this kind of alt-right phenomenon, there's again a new construction of whiteness being created within the U.S. that I think is going to take also a lot of kind of unpacking or something. There's this new kind of idea of European American that's not even white. It's almost more kind of reactionary than white or something. But, Standing Rock in that sense becomes incredibly potent and inspiring. Even, not to say that all of these conflicts haven't existed, because they do very much. Like I talked about some of these areas within it where there's non-native people, these kind of non-native ghettos, if you want to call it that or something. It's kind of bizarre. But I think, these things are incredibly potent, for the future to continue to see what that'll kind of lead towards. There's also a question, not just racially, but spatially, about kind of urban movements or political identities versus rural or kind of these other things. One of the other interesting parts of Standing Rock is that it's not a city. So just being in a city, it itself leads to certain kinds of political identification, kind of racial or ethnic identification, et cetera, versus if you're in a prairie or a field or a valley or a kind of river valley, you know what I mean? That itself has different forms of identification and different forms of political mobilization and solidarity and possibility or something. And I think more and more you'll see these kind of spatial configurations start to change as we think about politics, think about organization and infrastructure, think about power, basically. How does power function? And I think more and more with Standing Rock, you see power functions to some extent through infrastructure and through resources. And that's what you're seeing with these environmental movements or climate movements or something, to think more towards that and not some of these kind of spectacular circus things like that happen in cities, that happen in places like New York, which are incredibly absurd, So I think we can rethink of Standing Rock in that sense too. One of the things that could be a kind of lesson from Standing Rock for us who live in cities or live wherever is the extent to which people there were already organized and were already prepared for something like that. And I think one of the things, we spoke to a quote unquote elder in the camp we're staying in, and talked to him a little bit about Standing Rock, and he said the most important thing that really enabled the movement or the occupation was just the kinships that existed between people, between families or extended networks or extended families. And basically just a basic question of survival or something is that you can't, like in the conditions that are there now, you couldn't really go there as an individual and survive even. You have to do that with other people. So even just to think about this basic question of survival or something like if you need wood or water or food or a tent or tarps or supplies, it's not you as an individual who are answering those questions. You're answering those questions with other people, collectively or communally, and that becomes your kind of extended network or camp or commune or whatever you want to think about it. And I think that's one of the things we can do or think about now is what are the kind of forms of kinship or forms of organization that we have or can build and work towards that either could enable you to live in a brutal winter in Standing Rock in North Dakota, or that could enable you to live in New York City in the coming years or something. In some ways, they're the same question. You know, what are the kinships or collectivities or our kind of potentialities for encampments, literal and kind of metaphorical encampments or something that will enable us to kind of survive at all? And a big part of that in the city or in kind of metropolitan life is we're taught or think we have to think of that individually, like ourself, like how do I survive or something. But it's like, no, how do we survive together? How do we survive whatever that might come at us or something? And I think that's the kind of question that I'd be happy to talk about, you know, with any of these organizations or with elders or whoever, people who aren't on social media or something. It's that question, and again, it's kind of what we tried to get at in our video, what we tried to emphasize a little bit, and they talk about it in that, is these relationships and kinships are the basis for every little small camp in the movement, and it then becomes the basis of the whole movement, basically. Is there's a web of relations and kinships and a way of thinking that makes this possible. And I think that becomes a kind of global phenomenon. The potentiality of that has to become broader, you know, that there's different little webs of kinships or something that can become resilient or offensive or resistant or something to Trump or whatever it might be, Hurricane Sandy. It's the same question. You don't answer that question of Hurricane Sandy as an individual. You have to answer that with a group of people or whatever, you know? So I think, you know, that would be one response that I think we could all think about, you know, to what extent do we see ourselves within that kind of web or that kind of potential or that kind of relationality with each other, with our friends or families or neighbors, and even different generationally or something. If we have kids or parents or grandparents, how do we relate on that level to each other that we can answer these questions of survival? Basically, it becomes about survival, you know, together.